Hi everyone, and welcome to our new series that we're going to be looking at together as Lifechurch Manchester and as Bury Christian Fellowship. And over the weeks, different ones of us from Lifechurch and from Bury Christian Fellowship will take turns to speak into this series that we've called Living Through Strange Times. And we think this is an apt series to be thinking about. Living through strange and difficult times is not an unusual experience for God's people. And as we continue to live through this season, there are lessons that we can learn and encouragements that we can receive from those that we look back on that continue to trust and rely on God's promises and on God's presence despite challenging circumstances. So over the coming weeks, we're going to consider Moses and the people of Israel. We're going to consider Joshua, Jeremiah, Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther, and in a moment I'm going to look at Joseph. I guess throughout this we want to remind ourselves of the big story that we have the privilege of being a part of as we give ourselves to living as God's holy people in the good and the bad times, learning lessons from those that have gone before us, their successes and their failures. Those that lived right were not defined by the surrounding challenges, cultures, and circumstances. Instead, they were defined by their relationship with God, their identity in Him, and their trust in Him. And at this time, that needs to be true for us. So, today we're going to think about Joseph, and we've called this first one A Time for Perspective. A time for perspective. Perspective really matters. When we lose right perspective, we become vulnerable to making really poor decisions. When we lose perspective of where we are, where we lose perspective of who we are, then we can make decisions that we will regret later. Some of you may have heard me years ago tell a story about when I was, I like to think I was quite young, so we'll say I was about 12, and I went for a run from a house in Oxfordshire that we lived in on my own, and I started exploring a new route, and I ended up in fields in the middle of nowhere where there was no path, and I got myself a little bit lost really. And as I was going through these fields, I was running along the edge of the fields, and suddenly I found that I was being shot at. And I was absolutely terrified. I ran along this side of these ploughed up fields, and it was like there was like a cannon in the hedge, and it seemed like, in my mind, that up on a hill there was someone watching, and they were trying to shoot me. And this cannon, or these cannons, went off a couple of times as I ran past, and I actually had to pinch myself to check. It's going to sound a little foolish, to check that I was still alive. And when the second time that happened, I had so lost perspective of what was going on that I began to think that I was in an IRA hideout area, and I'd come into an area they didn't want me to be in, and they were shooting at me, and I thought, I've got away with it twice when they've shot and they've missed, I won't get away with it a third time. And so I walked into the field and I literally put my hands in the air, and I think I just thought that somehow people would come down from the hill or a helicopter would fly in and pick me up. And I waited and waited. And then after about 5 minutes or so, there was no movement, there was nothing. And I just thought, well, maybe I might be all right. And I turned and I ran out as fast as I possibly could. And when I got back home, I said to my parents what had happened and described what happened. And they sounded quite shocked and concerned initially. And then when they listened a bit more carefully, they realized that actually all that happened was I'd run past some bird scarers. Of course, my perspective had got completely lost, and I ended up making a real fool of myself. Fortunately, not many other people could see. It's just you get to hear the story now. The truth is that when I lose perspective, I am more vulnerable to give into sin. When I lose perspective, I am probably most vulnerable to settle for living just the ordinary life of the world rather than giving myself to the extraordinary life of a disciple. And Joseph appears to be someone that is an example of someone who did not lose sight of the sense of vision and destiny that God had placed on his life, despite a whole lot of very tough times and difficult circumstances. And we're going to just briefly consider some aspects of his story. First of all, the dream. He had a dream, and I guess it was that probably, amongst other things, gave him this sense of vision and destiny. And that's something that God wants to give to each and every one of us. It may not come through a dream, but he does want to give us that sense of us being called by him and him having vision for us, plans and purposes for us. When he calls you, he doesn't just call you to be saved, but he calls you to serve his incredible purposes and to play your part in his incredible plans and purposes. And I wonder if in this season, some of us may have lost sight of the incredible plans and purposes that he has for us, that we've somehow just got caught up with all the limitations and we've begun to lose sight of who he has really called us to be. And if that is the case, then we need to ask him to speak to us afresh, to give us that sense of call and destiny again, and not to let go of that, to give us fresh dreams. Because when you lose sight of who you are, what does it say in Proverbs? Without a vision, the people perish. And without vision, we are really, really vulnerable. So don't lose sight of the fact that God's got plans and purposes for your life. Then if we consider his story further, we can see that Joseph managed to maintain his perspective in times of temptation. In fact, it was probably that one of the things that helped him to handle temptation appropriately. There he was, things weren't probably working out as he had expected, as the dreams seemed to suggest they would. He'd been sold into slavery. He ends up in Potiphar's household. And there in Potiphar's household, he excels and he gets entrusted with more and more and more. But Potiphar's wife, who I imagine was good looking and attractive, doesn't specifically say that, but that's what I imagine, takes a fancy to him and tries to draw him into bed with her. And he runs from that temptation. Had he not had a perspective of who he was, of what it meant to live as God's chosen, holy people, as someone who was destined by God and had God's presence upon him, then who knows how he'd have responded. But he didn't lose sight of that. For me, there are times in my life that I have to say, I regret. I have lost sight of who I am. I've made choices. I've given into sin. I've watched stuff that I shouldn't have watched. In all sorts of ways, I've made mistakes. I've said things I shouldn't have said because I've lost sight of who I really am in him. I've lost some of that perspective. He maintained his perspective in times of temptation. He also maintained this perspective in times of disappointment, that when things weren't working out for them as they should, he was sold as a slave. He ends up in Potiphar's household, then he excels, then he's put in prison because of not doing anything wrong, but so seemingly treated unfairly, and he's put into prison. Again, he must be asking himself, where is God? Where is God in all of this? God, you showed me this vision and dreams of people bowing down to me, and how is this working out? This doesn't seem to, are you really there? And that can, if we're not careful, that can be a danger for anyone. In times of difficulty, in times of disappointment, we begin to ask the question, where is God? And that's where we need to keep our perspective of God seated on the throne. Even if the immediate circumstances are difficult and challenging, don't lose sight of the fact that God remains seated on the throne. And then finally, he maintained his perspective even in times of success. When he excelled, when he did well, he understood that actually all of his success came through God. It wasn't through his own accomplishments. It was through what God brought about. There he was, suddenly brought to the front and entrusted with everything pretty much by Pharaoh. And he excels. But he maintains a perspective that recognizes that God is in control. And I think we're vulnerable, whether we're going through difficulty or whether we're going through really good times. If we're not careful, we can take our eyes off God being the Lord, of God being the Most High, and begin to get caught up with ourselves. Our perspective must be God-centered, not man-centered. Our perspective must be his word-centered, not the world-centered. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 19, Joseph makes this statement. He says to his brothers, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I think that's just a fantastic perspective that in the midst of both the difficulties and the good times seem to reflect the fact that Joseph had an understanding that God is God and that he is sovereign. Keeping a perspective of God's sovereignty is really significant for all of us. And as I finish, I guess that's where I want to land, that for all of us in this season, I think there are two things that are especially important for us. First of all, that we maintain our perspective of who God has called us to be and therefore how he wants us to live. And secondly, that we maintain our perspective of God's sovereignty when things are going well and when things are going badly.